Hello again, 102. To conclude Kennedy and Foreign Affairs, the Cuban Missile Crisis will be Kennedy's finest moment in his administration. And October 16, 1962, photos taken by U.S. spy planes had revealed that the Soviet missile site existed in Cuba. And although their actions violated no law or treaty, Kennedy decided that the 40 or so missiles had to be removed. But how? And so the Soviets felt that they were justified in doing this because the United States had earlier installed missiles with nuclear warheads in Turkey along the Soviet border. And over the next 13 days, perhaps the most dangerous 2 weeks in history, Kennedy and the National Security Council discussed several possible responses, ranging from doing nothing to invading Cuba. The commander of the Marines at one point reminded the group that the missiles were not a true threat, but the group insisted that the missiles be removed for symbolic reasons. After all, Cuba is only 90 miles, ladies and gentlemen, off the coast of Florida. At that point, the world came closer to a war involving the exchange of nuclear weapons than it ever has before or since. Kennedy and the National Security Council discussed in some detail the unthinkable possibility of a nuclear war, even estimating the damage that atomic bombs might inflict on major cities. Eventually, though, the group narrowed the options to a choice between a surgical airstrike, which is what Curtis LeMay favored, the former head of the bombing missions in World War II in Europe, and a naval blockade of Cuba. Although the military advisors urged bombing the missile sites followed by an invasion of the island, Kennedy chose the naval blockade, which was carefully disguised by calling it a quarantine, since a blockade is technically an act of war. A nice bold stroke by Kennedy. On Monday night, October 22nd, President Kennedy delivered a solemn television speech to the world announcing that the United States Navy was establishing a naval quarantine of Cuba to prevent Soviet ships from delivering the goods and weapons that the island nation depended upon. He urged the Soviets to move the world back from the abyss of destruction. Tensions grew as Khrushchev replied that Soviet ships would ignore the quarantine. He accused Kennedy of an act of aggression, propelling humankind into the abyss of a world nuclear missile war. Despite such rhetoric, however, on Wednesday, October 24th, 5 Soviet ships, presumably with more missiles aboard, stopped well short of the quarantine line. 2 days later, Khrushchev, knowing that the United States still enjoyed a 5-to-1 advantage in nuclear weapons, offered a deal. This was all in a great Hollywood movie, 13 Days, starring Kevin Costner, if you're interested. Neither he nor Kennedy wanted to be the first president to launch nuclear missiles. The Soviets would remove the missiles in return for a public pledge by the United States not to invade Cuba, and a secret agreement to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. And Kennedy agreed. Secretary of State Dean Rusk stressed to a newscaster, "Remember, when you report this, say that eyeball to eyeball, they, the Soviets, blinked first." And the Soviets then removed the missiles under this nuclear threat that they were under. And this is Kennedy's best moment. In the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, tension between the United States and the Soviet Union subsided, in part because of several symbolic steps. There was an agreement to sell the Soviet Union surplus American wheat. There was the installation of a hotline telephone between Washington and Moscow to provide instant contact between the heads of government, and the removal of aging United States missiles from Turkey, Italy, and Britain. And now there will be further control of atomic weapons. Kennedy, in June 1963, began discussions with the Soviets to reduce the risk of nuclear war. If we cannot end our differences, he said, at least we can help make the world a safe place for diversity. After 2 months of difficult negotiations, those discussions resulted in the Test Ban Treaty, bans the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. And it was with the Soviet Union and Great Britain, and it was ratified in September 1963. Another good move by Kennedy. It was an important move towards improved relations with the Soviet Union. As Kennedy put it, using an ancient Chinese proverb, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. And again, this was the closest the world has come to nuclear war since 1945. Kennedy in Vietnam. The situation in South Vietnam had worsened under the corrupt leadership of Premier Ngo Dinh Diem and his family. Diem had backed away from promised social and economic reforms, and his repressive tactics, directed not only against communists but also against the Buddhist majority and other critics, played into the hands of his enemies. And Kennedy continued to dispatch military advisors to South Vietnam in the hopes of stabilizing the situation. They were called advisors to avoid the impression that U.S. troops were doing the fighting, even though they were actually involved in combat. When he took office, the United States had 900 troops in Vietnam, and by the end of 1963 there were 16,000, all of whom were officially classified as advisors rather than combatants. If I tried to pull out, Kennedy explained, we would have another Joe McCarthy Red Scare on our hands, with Cold War hawks accusing him of losing Vietnam to communism. We must be patient, and we must persist. By 1963, Kennedy was receiving sharply conflicting reports from South Vietnam. By mid-year, frequent Buddhist demonstrations against Diem ignited widespread discontent. The spectacle of Buddhist monks setting themselves on fire in public squares to protest government tyranny stunned Americans. And there's an example of self-immolation. By the fall of 1963, the Kennedy administration had decided that the autocratic Diem was out of touch with his people and had to go. On November 1st, U.S.-backed Army generals seized the South Vietnamese government, but then took a step that Kennedy had neither intended nor expected. They murdered Diem and his brother. The rebel generals, however, provided no more political stability than had Diem, and successive coups set the fragile country spinning from one military leader to another. Thereafter, unstable South Vietnam essentially became an American colony. The United States put the generals in power, gave the orders, and provided massive financial support, much of which was diverted into the hands of corrupt politicians. This is just a sorry situation. During that tumultuous fall of 1963, Kennedy seemed to have developed doubts about the ability of the United States to prop up the South Vietnamese government. When asked about the South Vietnamese effort to hold off communist insurgents, he replied, in the final analysis, it's their war. They're the ones who have to win it or lose it. And we talked about this. This is the second Indochina War. We can help them as advisors, but they have to win it. And then Kennedy's assassination. What Kennedy would have done thereafter in Vietnam has remained a matter of endless discussion. See Oliver Stone's movie. It's fantastic. JFK, for all the conspiracy theories, because in October 1963, he announced his intention to withdraw U.S. forces from South Vietnam by the end of 1965. And did Lee Harvey Oswald act alone from the Texas School Book Depository building with a rifle? Was he part of a group of people that fired on the president in Dallas, Texas? And on November 22nd, Kennedy was shot dead visiting in Dallas. Did the conspirators, if they existed, really want the more military-friendly Lyndon Baines Johnson as their president? And so ends Kennedy in Foreign Affairs.